Hey everybody, Edo here, and I am super excited today because we are going to be talking about rule books and editing, which is just a active and present part of my life and many other folks' lives. We have two fantastic people on. Dustin Schwartz, rulebook editor, writer extraordinaire, like almost 200 different rule books you've worked on, dozens of companies. Mr. Rulebook, right? Pretty much.
I guess that's me.
And for Pencil First Games, helped on Skull Hollow and now Mall Peak, but many other rule books. And then we have Jessica Walker, who's the sales and operation manager for Pencil First Games, but has also turned out to be a all-star editor and a very active part of our rule book work here. So I thought it'd be fun to have the two of you on to just talk about the process of rulebook writing and editing, and what you should think about from the start, pitfalls, just a general conversation. It's a critical part of the product game development process, right? Getting a good rulebook is the interface for making sure that you players are engaged with and successful at working on your game. And in particular, I don't want to have the conversation about necessarily, we can talk whatever the two of you want to talk about, but this isn't about the initial part of I want to talk about rule book refinement, getting a rule book to a really good spot. Oftentimes, Dustin, when we bring you onto something from a Pencil First perspective, the game has been built, we have an idea, we have a first version of the rule book ready, and then you're like, yeah, I see what you did here, we're going to get rid of that, and then we're going to do it this way. And similarly, Jessica, you've come in, and so I want to talk about that part of it, because I think it's so important. So, to start, Dustin, when you approach a project, you've been reached out, they're like, here's a rule book. What are some of the first things that you do to start building out and getting a AAA rule book going?
That's a good question. I don't have a checklist that I check against. It's kind of on a per project basis, but there are commonalities that you see that crop up. And one of the things that I see a fair bit is information chunking. It sounds boring, but oftentimes there's too much information that's being presented at one time, and by at one time I often mean in a single paragraph. We read so much of the content that we read in 21st century now is on the internet, and there's plenty of white space, great short content, and it can be kind of exhausting then to sit down with a manual and just power through humongous paragraphs where you don't have great reference points for the rules you're learning. It's just all information download. And to ease that process, I often find that it needs to be chunked into much smaller bits than what is initially presented when whoever wrote the rule book kind of laid it out.
So let's talk about that. I certainly agree. Oftentimes when I get a rule book from a designer, in particular, it looks like that, right? It's just a gigantic, not necessarily train of thought, but very dense setup. When you start thinking about chunking, Dustin, okay, so I guess there's two parts to it. One is just taking any dense piece of information and breaking it apart. But then there's also the process, which I talked with Rodney Smith when we were talking about rule books, I don't know, a couple months ago, maybe 6 months ago, about sort of order of information and how you present and that. So do you attack that first? Do you say, no, I just want to break out the chunks more and then order them? I mean, how do you think of it in that regard?
I think it's good to look at your overall outline first and make sure that all is flowing in the order that you want, that it's kind of the order in which you want your players to come to the information. And then you kind of drill down to the next level and you take one, subsection at a time now, not the entire rule book, but maybe whatever it is, 1/3 of the rule book where this third of the game is described. Then you look at everything within that and make sure that, okay, this is how we want to make this flow. It's tricky with modern games because designers are so clever. Sometimes the rules are so clever that it's really difficult to communicate them well, and you end up with the flow being difficult to do in a way that is good for both learning the game the first time and also when you want to go and look later and you're like, this rule should be in this section. Why am I not finding it here? Well,
yeah, so I think that's a couple of really important nuggets that I would just split out. One is, and I think this is easily forgotten by many folks, is that outline phase, right? Like you have the rules. It's easy to start just wanting to form it, right? Like, oh, okay, I'm going to put a picture here. And those people might take a paragraph and say, okay, we'll make these bullets. But it's almost like intrinsically assuming that this presentation is right. I'm just going to improve it. But backing up for a second, I mean, and this is something we do at Pencil First Games, but backing up for a second and actually like, I typically do it on paper, but you could do it on Google or whatever, but breaking in and saying like, hey, we're going to have these sections first and then chunking, this is this section, this is this section, this is this section, and just dirty doing it, like getting it all sort of blocked and organized in an outline, make the outline and then put the content in it. And then going through that process is, I think, a very helpful and productive way of doing it. The next situation, and this is something, Jessica, I'll flip to you. We talk about a lot when this whole idea of rulebook to teach how to play something, like rulebook for a new player experience and ramping them up, and then accuracy and completeness of information as a reference material, right? Like is a tension that you feel, because the more reference, the more call-outs you put in there, the more slower the learn is oftentimes, and potentially confusing. When you've been looking at and sort of editing and breaking down rule books, how do you think about that approach? And like, what are some common mistakes or issues you've seen as you've moved through them?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is that learning process and how a new player is going to get to that rule book, and kind of tying that into what's in the game box. So like, what are they actually going to see first? If you explain a concept that's too complicated first, they're going to be like, well, wait, I'm not going to learn this until page 12. Like, what are you doing? So there's a flow in there of a teaching flow, a learning flow. That's also part of what that rule book is going to be laid out as. And I'm trying to think. I like the chunking part. I like that the term that we're using here of how to lay that out. I also look at a lot of continuity. Like if we call something a specific component is this in one place, got to make sure that flows throughout, because that's another confusion point. If there's one instance where that is just called this special deck, someone's gonna be like, what are you talking about? That was never in the rules. And I think that the goal there is for new players, is not to have them flipping back and forth and being like, where did you reference this? Okay, what is this for? What is that? There's a flow of like page 1, 2, 3, 4 of just kind of taking you through the concepts and how to play, and figuring out how to word that. The wording is always fun.
All right. Well, so let's and just for everyone listening, I was just like, we're gonna just dive in. Let's not prepare at all and just start having a conversation. But like, okay, there's some key ideas that I want to like reiterate, and then you just brought up another one I want to get Dustin's perspective on. So, hey, have an outline, understand the flow and presentation of your rules. When you're looking at rules, make sure you're like not having gigantic blocks of information, but breaking it up and breaking it down the chunks into pieces, pebbles, boulders, rocks, whatever, breaking it up into things that are, consumable. And as we're doing this, we're thinking about how it's the difference between that teaching players and the reference. Another concept you just brought up, which is like routinely a problem. I suffer from it. It is a major cleanup in all of our rules. And I think this is true for more than just Pencil First Games, is this idea of a lexicon, right? Is this idea of terminology. And so like, I think there's common pitfalls in terms of tense of presentation of rules, word usage, like lexicon definition of terms, capitalization. So Dustin, can you speak to like the common, like sort of grammar consistency, language consistency issues you deal with? Because I suspect one of the things that you face often at the very start of a project is like this problem throughout everything you're looking at.
Yeah, no, you're not wrong. The lexicon thing, it's a tricky balance to walk because you don't want to. You're immediately going to introduce another level of, I don't know, intimidation factor if you like have an actual dictionary of your game's terms somewhere.
Oh, and to be clear, I'm not necessarily saying you present that to the player as much as it's the team has one. Like even internally, you have one. But keep going.
Right. Yeah. And I'm a big fan of kind of drip feeding the lexicon, so to speak, just throughout the rules, rather than, sometimes you do need, like if your lexicon expands enough, then just having a little reference somewhere, like what we have in the Skokala rules, just a half page of, hey, these are important terms. If you ever wonder exactly what that means, it's here. But I often think of it like a textbook. That I think back to like science textbooks in high school and how when you're flipping through, the first time that they use an important term, they're kind of defining it in how they use it, and they bold it, and that's kind of the first time, and that's how like, okay, this is important. I got to remember. They just told me what whatever it is, stochastic flow is or something.
Yeah.
And so now you know what that is. You've kind of internalized it, and that's, I find, a bit easier than just having like a list of just all the definitions. But you're right that you have to, you got to make sure that those are all consistent. And I often will either make or suggest at least additional keywords that didn't exist in the original game. And the reason that I do that sometimes is because I find that there is a specific process or like a collection of rules, or like maybe not even rules, but just these are all the things that you have to do physically when this particular rule occurs, how you manipulate these game pieces on the table. It's a specific thing related to how the game was produced. That is like a couple of sentences. And when we have to repeat that, like even a half a dozen times, I think, well, what if we kind of explain that all this stuff means this, and it's just a simple 2-word phrase, and now we can use that as it permeates elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean a good example of that's pretty canonical is tapping in Magic, right? Tapping a land means you're going to turn it, it's going to give you a resource, it's this on the card, and blah 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 blah, and then crushing that down into an icon then allows you to do that. I think I wasn't entirely clear with my question. So there's the lexicon side of it, but just I feel like early on in the rulebook process, you have this conversation around like, okay, what are the things that we're going to bold, or what is our capitalization? Do we capitalize in the word action card? Is it action capped and card capped? Is it neither? There's certainly, I mean, I suspect, Dustin, and I'm curious, you have like your specific perspective on, like, generally speaking, I think you should do it this way. I tend to lean more on like I'm okay with a little bit broader choices in terms of how rulebooks do it. It's just about being consistent, right? Like if you're gonna bold all your key terms, bold all your key terms. If you're gonna italicize these names, italicize these names. And I feel like they're like early on, I guess was my question. I suspect you see a lot of rulebooks that have varying capitalization approaches, varying use of the word player to the word you, to the word he, him, her, like just as if they were written by 4 people or edited again and half fixed. Like when you are approaching that part of a new rulebook, sort of the what's the word I'm looking for? The
style guide.
Yeah, well, you can call it a style guide, sure. Like, do you produce it? Do you just discuss it? Like, how do you bring that to ground so that you can bring it in? Because when you do a refined rulebook, from my experience reading the ones that you've put together, that's all very clear. Like, that's all consistent is a better word than clear. So what's your approach to sort of dialing that in?
You're right. I do kind of have one that just lives in my head as a default, and then I just kind of check items off against the publisher's wishes one at a time, asking, hey, is it okay if we make this change? Are you cool with this stylistic choice? And occasionally you'll have people who feel strongly about a particular, like a house style guide for a given publisher, which is fine. Like you said, as long as we're consistent, I'm okay with it, even if it's not necessarily the choice I would have made. And there are times when I have put that list, that style guide, so to speak, down on paper, made a separate document so that if someone else needed to be checking those same things, or in the case of a larger project with multiple editors on board, we're all on the same page regarding these particular choices that we might otherwise have, personal preferences on. So that is useful to do. And I do usually do that early on, although it's often mental rather than anything committed to paper.
Right,
but,
right.
Yeah, you're right. Like capitalization, using, some rulebook writers prefer to use a passive voice in how they phrase the rules. It's not necessarily bad. I think I usually prefer to write more actively, but when you see those two styles kind of clashing, maybe they wrote the rulebook one time, went back and rewrote X phase later on, and unthinkingly wrote it in the other voice, and you notice that clash.
Right.
You're right. It's mostly about the consistency, making sure that it feels like a cohesive document.
Right. So, yeah, going back to you, Jessica, something that I've watched you do is like you're able to very rigorously review and check and sort of, I mean, for lack of a better term, edit a rule book. When you are looking for, like, can you describe, I mean, the answer could just be, I'm that good, I just read it and I know the answer. But is there a process? Is there like a way that you sit down and like do you have your notes open? Do you read it first? Like, what's your process to be like, I'm going to sit down and edit this 3, 8, 20 page thing with like rigorously? Like, do you take breaks? Like, what's the process to like getting into that state and flow?
Yeah. So sometimes I just kind of jump in, like I'll have my notes ready and I just start taking like a first pass of notes. But it's really first I'm looking at understanding the rule book, because a lot of these I see before I've played the game. I don't know the game yet. So I also kind of approach it as, again, like we're talking about a new player, and I just kind of get into that mindset of, does this make sense? Is this, am I learning the concepts in the right order? And then I'm also looking for, I'll take, a first pass of notes, like there's a double space here, there's a spelled wrong, there's a couple of, initial things that I see in that first pass. And then once I kind of have my head wrapped around, all right, here's how the rule book is laid out, I'm going to learn this, this, and this. Then I'll start to dig in and be like, all right, we introduced this concept early on, it's called this. Is that consistent throughout? Is there a good example for this? There might be, we're explaining something, but is there a visual example? And also understanding the tone. I think Dustin mentioned like passive and active voice. There's also sort of a tone in terms of, am I putting fun stuff in this? How is this rule book, is it a very serious sort of, here's the rules, this is how you play, but it's nicely laid out? Or is it like, I think we had this like with Floriferous, where we needed a term, or Delicious, I should say, with a term for you can't move these plants or whatever. So I think I wrote like, they have roots, you can't erase them or something. So adding in a little bit of fun in terms of that tone of how someone's learning that game, and keeping that, again, consistent. I think consistency is one of the big things with a rule book in terms of a lot of different aspects. So I usually, Ed has seen my spreadsheets of all the stuff to change. I'm like,
well, yeah. I mean, becomes I think we should spend a couple minutes talking about how those edits are made in different approaches and evolutions we've done over time. But yeah, they become 150 line spreadsheets. I've certainly seen those. So much so that actually with both of you, it's just like, let's work out this version where you just edit the file and we don't have to deal with the spreadsheet anymore. I think that actually I want to comment on tone briefly, because that's something I think. So there's like an inherent concept in here. Obviously, Jessica, you work directly with Pencil First Games all the time, Dustin on specific projects, but it's first and foremost this idea of getting a rulebook editor, right? The idea of, hey, you're working on a project, you have a rulebook. There's people are pretty used to the concept of blind testing and stuff like that, but but just the inherent value to getting somebody who specializes in editing to be on working and doing a review. I think like there's that. I didn't like lead with that premise, but the premise is it is worth your time and money to have that done for sure, because it really will have a huge impact to the quality of the product experience and the reduction of, issues and mistakes and confusion and BGG threads and stuff like that. Though even at your best, you're still going to miss something, is my experience. But I think on the tone part, that's an interesting one, because one of the things I find is that oftentimes when you have an editing pass, it can erase some tone and some language, right? Like cleaning, like it's not always true, but as you try to become more accurate and clear, oftentimes that means less colloquial, less humorous, less, because it's an effort to be accurate. And I do feel like oftentimes there's a balance post-editing where going back as a creative lead or product owner and re-reviewing, and I mean, you should always review the stuff, but like getting a sense of being like, hey, yeah, this is now more clear, but it feels like we're just like admonishing the player on page 2 of the rulebook. Is there a way we can soften it up? This delicious example was just, we discovered we wanted to have a reminder that like you can't erase, but to like a big bold exclamation on the first page that says like, hey, once you write, you're not allowed to erase. Like it was like one of those like flip and write standard rules, but like we didn't actually have it in the rulebook anyway. Softening that up, or in the case of siblings trouble, places where the language is intended to also carry some thematic weight to it. And so I think that's a challenge, and it is one of these places where sometimes rulebook I find you have to go through this process of like, you do a pass, then the editor does a pass, and you come back, and then you tell the editor the changes, and they're like, whoa, and then you go back and forth. But let's talk about that idea of sort of tracking changes and fixing and then confirming and approaches. So I mean, Dustin, you've done a huge volume of these with just like a broad range of folks. Have you sort of landed on best practices when it comes to sort of the actual correction work?
Sure. Well, I like to do most of my work. If I had my preference, this is how I do it all the time, is before it's gone to layout. Because once it's gone to layout, then you've got often a third party who's then putting in the changes, right? And that introduces another layer, another possibility for errors. So if I'm working in a Google Doc, which is my preference, where it's just text and some basic formatting, what I will do usually is I'm talking to whoever's rulebook it is, if it's the publisher, maybe the designer, and I'll ask them about like a particular change. And then if they give me the thumbs up for that particular change, I will put it in and populate it across the entire rulebook wherever, say, this keyword change needs to be made, or if we're changing the tone from passive to active or something like that. And the nice thing about a service like Google Docs or anything that's cloud-based, you can do this with PDFs on Dropbox even, right? Is you put those, you can mark up changes and everyone can see it in real time. You get into a lot of trouble, I think, with versioning issues when you're just like emailing PDFs back and forth, that kind of thing. Because, I'm looking at version 1.76 of the rules, Jess is looking at 1.77, and you get wires crossed and a lot of extra work that's being redone. So I don't know if that answers your question exactly. But
no, I think
okay.
Well, yeah, I think so. At a start, and this is we've gone through different versions. With Skull Hollow, I know we, before bringing you in, we had it all laid out, and it was in a document. To some degree, I'm a fairly visual person, and when working through a player experience, I do it better actually in layout. So for me, getting it right and getting the order right is a little bit of like seeing it in motion, right? Which is an expensive way of doing it. But then with Mall Peak, for example, we already sort of had a presentation of layout style. The game's a lot more known because it's a sequel. But that was, we did the Mall Peak rules, just as you said, in that Word doc. and then we're able to pass it over to you, and then you did all the edits, and then we brought it in. But so that's in this first phase where at that point, other than getting clarification, you're just working on a Google Doc and editing and changing stuff. But like, and when you say just for the people listening, if you don't know what he means by layout, he just means the words in just written in a Google Word or Google Doc, as opposed to the graphic design layout of the presentation within the page and the art and the examples. Because this is the next question, which is that editing did or didn't happen. It now has been laid out. There is this file. Maybe it's an InDesign with connected assets and stuff like that. Then when you are doing another review of that version, I assume your preference is still to, if possible, to edit the InDesign file, sort of locked out from the graphic designer for a period of time. But absent from that, or like, how do you like to handle sort of the issue, like, hey, I did a review, here's all the fixes, sort of that spreadsheet thing that Jessica was talking about?
Yeah, well, the way that y'all have done it works pretty well. I think late in the process, where we have a separate team shared spreadsheet like that, and we're able to put in notes, hey, this is an issue on this in this portion of the rules or on this card, and detail what it is, and in some cases even assign whose responsibility it is to implement that fix or review it. That works really well late in the process. There's often a few stages between there, like after initial layout, and it can be tedious when, like you're saying, if that gets to be like a couple hundred lines in a spreadsheet, to work through all those. So I still will use my Google document at that stage. Google has a great commenting feature. Dropbox does this too with PDFs. And that allows you to, rather than like having to spell out where it is, this change needs to be made. The document is still in there front to back in the same order it is in the laid out version with all the graphic design. Doesn't look quite the same, but it's still all, you can find it easily, right? And so you can just comment up, hey, this word here is misspelled, or this sentence, we're line breaking too early on this sentence, it's creating an issue in the layout. So I usually do all that still in the Google Doc, and then as long as the publisher's okay with it, then whoever's doing the graphic design and layout can just look at my notes, and once they got them done, they can just resolve them or comment, got it fixed. Right.
And to tease this out a little bit, it's like there are different weights. There's different opacity or costs of work that are associated with these different flows, right? So like one could imagine, because a spreadsheet, you could imagine a Trello board or a bug database where you have really rigorous checking and review, funneling of information and assignment automation, but it's like this heavy tool that you got to open up to bring in your edits. The spreadsheet, which you described, and just for people who aren't familiar, it's a column that says like location, page, sublocation, description, who found it, is it, I guess at the beginning would say, is it open, in progress, closed, like just a very simple sort of tracking spreadsheet. And then approved, right, has been reviewed and confirmed. Because oftentimes a graphic designer will say something's done, and maybe it was done, but maybe it wasn't done correctly, or there was a mistake. This interesting step that you described that you've also done, because I've seen it, turns into stuff like 4 edits on page 4 or whatever, but see my Google Doc. And then in the Google Doc, it's like this. And I think the advantage there, to some degrees, as you said, is you don't have to write out page 4, third paragraph, second sentence, you're referring to it. So I agree with you. There's all sorts of different sort of timing and phasing that stuff happens for sure. And I think to some extent it's about what works for the team. There are some interesting problems that start coming out with bigger teams and bigger projects. And I don't even want to consider like Role Play Adventure crazy, like huge, gigantic monsters. But so one I just mentioned, which is sometimes when you are collaborating between different people making fixes, sometimes there are fix fails. For some reason it didn't happen. And sometimes there are, fix mistakes, right? Like where you misinterpret it. Like one, they they copied the text and pasted it in, but pasted it wrong. Or like they thought you wanted it over here, but they didn't do it over there. Or you wanted it in all instances of X, but they just the first instance of it, right? So those kinds of things where you need to verify, you need to check that it was actually fixed correctly. And so there's like that interesting category. But the other one you mentioned, which is rampant late game, and I mean, I remember Jamie Stegmaier did a big one on this, is like versioning issues that have to do with cross-team changes impacting things, like the value of an attack changing in one place in a card, but not reflected in the rule book, or this asset getting renamed here in a playtest or refinement that somebody adjusted sometimes it's really simple, like the way this ability is described was refined in a rulebook review to have consistent language with the rulebook, which made it no longer identical to how it's set on the card. So now you have two places an ability is described slightly differently, and as is routinely the case, one opens up a rule, a corner case, the other one didn't, right? So what you have is somebody who has a question, refers to the rule book, and then sees two different pieces of information, and very quickly will be like, well, that one says will, and that one says, like that one says may, and that one says can, or like will, may, or must, or something like that, like something stupid like that. And suddenly it's like, well, now I don't know how to play this game anymore. Have you come up with, either of you, thoughts on like approaches to avoid that? Like how have you dealt with that over project over project? Jessica, why don't you start?
It will be me. I think we've seen this where it's actually better to define something once rather than repeatedly copying that line in multiple places. Because again, if you do change it, it's going to be in multiple places. You got to make sure it's there. But also just changing that language very slightly, even if it's not, like you were saying, there was may, must. You can have may or can. And there's always some confusion over, well, I may do this, I can do this. What's the definition? They're basically the same word, but they do get interpreted differently. So kind of having it in one place and then sort of referencing it. So rather than saying like, here's the definition of what you do with these type of cards, and I'm going to put it on pages 2, 7, 10, 11, 12. I'm just going to keep putting it over and over. It's better to introduce the concept, have it on like page 2, and then say, hey, you're going to use these cards. Look at page 2. Go back to that, and then have that reference in one spot versus having it over and over again. And that runs the risk of just somehow, even if the sentence is the same, the context that it's in, the surrounding sentences, what else is on the page, that can still sometimes open up opportunities for confusion. And I think the biggest part is avoid confusion. Consistency and avoiding confusion is that's the main part of rulebook editing, at least for me, and finding misspellings. I don't know. Those are exciting times for me.
Sure. It's a skill. How about on your side, Dustin? I mean, Jessica's example was sort of like reduce the amount of opportunities for that kind of issue to occur. But when you're, especially because I think Jessica inherently on Pencil First Game stuff has like a more context than like your average contractor editor who's come in at this flow with this document. How do you sort of manage and deal with you being a part of a process that's moving and changing sort of while you're working and you don't have visibility on that?
Yeah, it can be tricky. The main point, the main inflection point where I think those sorts of versioning errors happen is something like the example you said, Ed, which is that it can happen if I'm given the rule book and put X amount of hours into it, and I think, yes, we got it, this thing is airtight, and then find out later, well, shoot, it doesn't jive with the cards or something like that. And that is that when I take on a project, I try to stress to the client that I want to edit all of your game's text. It's not just the rule book. I want to edit the rules, and the rules sometimes exist on components, like cards. That's the most common one, of course. Reference materials, those sorts of things, and that's often where the disconnect happens. Is that the rule book got tightened up and those changes got left out of other materials because you think, well, the rule book's good, we got it. So that's something I usually ask for, not just to look at, but even to review in the early going as I'm working on the rules, because oftentimes the way that this particular thing is worded, it may be like it's not A+ material for the rule book. With all that space that we have in the rules, we could have said it this way, but we're limited because it's got to appear on a card somewhere else. And so we need to be constrained a little bit by the needs of how the rules appear elsewhere. So having all that context as I tackled the rule book itself prevents some of that, some extra work, basically, where we would change something and realize, well, that works for the rule book, but does not work elsewhere where that needs to appear. We're going to create an error, either have them not worded the same or have to change a font size to get all that extra text on the cards. So that's been super useful, is just making sure, by the way, show me all your cards, show me your reference mats, back of the rule book, where we're going to have reference guides, all that stuff. It's all part of the rules. It's all part of how the players interface with the game.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's been a huge part of a lot of the Skull Hollow and Malpeak work. I mean, I would add to that. I generally, whenever anyone related to a game is on the product, graphic designer or to anybody, I strongly believe they got to play the game, right? Like I think just like whether it's over tabletop simulator, Tabletopia, whatever, or you're in person playing prototype, having. And again, even an illustrator, like having a concept of the world, the fun, the engagement, the mechanics, I think helps inform and baseline a lot of the overall sort of vibe of the project, and I think that's really helpful. And then, as you said, right, like we've talked about that Google Doc, but like on Malpeak and Skull Hollow, there's this Google spreadsheet with like 70 tabs, which is like, here's the card text, here's this text, here's like Rapture cards, Tantos cards, etc. I do think it gets challenging, even some other weird oddities. We had a solo experience that was like totally separate from Malpeak, that was sort of made by a different team, which Dustin, you hadn't been involved in. And then, in my head, at some point over the project, I thought, and then after you play it, you get a card, you get some abilities and cards that you can play in the main games that do interact with the standard system. And in my head, we had shown it to you, and then like as we're going through this refinement phase at the end, I was like, you know what, I don't think he ever saw these. And so then it was like presenting it, and it's like, oh, this isn't phrased the way we would phrase it. This isn't this. Can I just rewrite all of it? It's like, sure. But it's an example of like where you have these interlocking spots. And I do think it's very difficult, like even in like a project we have right now, because we're going to bug you again soon. We're going through and we're heavily play testing, right? And, as part of that, we're going to adjust in a card or, real like simple example. I don't want to get too so basically there's this ability, Mystify, by the way, where there's like this abusive play where you can just sort of like repeat use it by using it for the same thing, and it's sort of like, it's just not a fun, it's like a mechanic, like once you can do it, you just have to do it because it's an abusive thing. So we have to like put a call out, and we were like debating on where to do that, and ultimately it's going to become a note, and we're going to discuss with you and have a back and forth on where best to put this little extra line of text. But I do think it's important to come to a place when you're working with an editor where there's an understanding that it's not like, I guess what I'm trying to communicate in a broad sense is, don't think about and I'm not talking to you two because you know this, but don't think about editing as a single pass thing. Think of it as something that you're going to be doing at various times over the course of development, and you want to make sure you come back to it and do a sweep all the way to the final end to make sure that there wasn't some weird pivot somewhere else that changed things and got everything out of aligned. And I think that's more of just an awareness thing, and bucketing some money to cover type of thing for publishers to keep in mind. So we've been talking for a while. Going again back to each of you, what are a couple that like things that we haven't covered, common mistakes, if any, you've seen, and or recommendations you would make for publishers or designers with their rule book. Like, is there anything that we didn't cover that comes to mind, starting with you, Dustin?
Well, it's good to have reference materials. The rule book is great, but I think a lot of times the designer, whoever it is that writes the rules initially, they just think of it as you got the one document, and then it's left up to the publisher to, if they're going to consider form factor and think, well, we've got player screens, we should probably have reminder text on those. Do they need a card? Is the back of the rule book a couple like bulleted lists for important procedures? Is that sufficient? And so if you can work on those from the start, matter of fact, something like a reference guide, you could even, we talked earlier about like starting with an outline. Your outline, if it's good, can be easily repurposed for something like a reference guide. Something just, quick and dirty that gives you the basics, and then you can drill down into the rules to learn all the specifics. And that often gets left out in the early stages. Kind of comes in late sometimes, and then again, it's one of those things where it's a different need for the game. And sometimes if you would have known or accounted for that need, how much space you have, that sort of thing early on, that may even have changed how you wrote certain portions of the rules, or how you staggered the information,
right?
Sorts of things. So that's something to keep in mind early on. I think that they're going to learn the game this way, but you don't want them to have to be flipping through the rules all the time. And even games that we're all players that you've played so many times, like you think, I don't remember that specific thing. Does this step come before that step? Do I get to do this before that has to occur? That's those sorts of things, and you've got those sorts of reference materials.
I have to check on games we've published, like games I've played. Yeah. Many. I'm like, oh, how does this work again? Select the designer. Did I get this right 2 years later? Please tell me I understand how to do this. No, I think that's a really good one. How about on your end, Jessica?
To build off a couple of things that Dustin said, the back of the rule book, that last page is actually, that could be a great reference point for just like putting quick setup rules or like just the flow of the game. That's a great part. That's not actually like a separate component. It's part of the rule book. It can be really useful for players coming back to games, and just as like, here it is, here's how we play. So that part I think sometimes gets lost in the shuffle sometimes, because it's just the back of the rule book. Who cares? It's a great page to put some really good information. And then building off of like summary cards or reference cards. I think we mentioned this before, but it's not just copying and pasting everything from the rule book. It's looking at the space. And I think sometimes like tiny fonts are just a reference card. I've seen this, it just gets ruined when it's just, I'm going to put these giant paragraphs in like teeny tiny, like 6-point font. Everybody can read this, right? No, they can't. So making sure that those are actually usable. I've seen some games that I'm like, yes, summary cards, this is going to be great, and they're not usable. So it's almost like, there's a little bit of a waste of putting those in there. And then to add another one, I think we've talked about this a little bit, Ed, is the solo rules, and how does for games that have a solo mode, how do you introduce that and have a good learning experience for the first solo, for a person who's playing solo? I do solo a lot, and there is, having a separate rule book can be great. Other times there's a lot of flipping back and forth, and I've seen, it's almost like I'm used to that now, where I'm like, all right, I'm gonna learn solo, so I gotta learn the multiplayer, then the solo. But sometimes just having, if there's different modes, it doesn't necessarily have to be solo. There's sometimes variants that people want to start with. Sometimes even a 3 to 4 player game plays completely differently at 3 or 4 players. You have to learn those. Just kind of having that as thinking of that flow too, because even, and I use solo a lot as an example, but making a game solo friendly also should mean having a pretty good solo learning experience. It should not feel tacked on.
Right. And it's something we're working on, and as well as small text and pocket editions is always a fun debate. But So let's just, we've been on for 45 minutes. Thank you both for coming on. Like, it is a pleasure to talk to you both, and also just the passion and love for what you do in this regard is fantastic. Dustin, if folks are, because Jessica tends to focus on the pencil first games, but Dustin, if folks are looking for your time to have you work on rule books, how do they get in touch with you?
Sure. Oddly enough, most of my work comes through Twitter if it's not existing clients. On Twitter, I'm Dustin B. Schwartz. Also, I do have a website. It's therulesforge.com. I'm not sure I've updated that in the past 2 months, but you'll find rates on there and a list of games I've worked on and stuff like that. So, yeah, Twitter is I'm pretty accessible there too. Even for just one-off rules queries, sometimes get those like, "Hey, how would you phrase this?" Those are fun little word problems to solve.
Yeah, word problems. I like it. All right. Well, thanks so much for being on this morning, and thanks to everyone for watching us talk about rule books. Awesome. Talk to you later. Bye.
Hey everybody, Edo here, and thanks for watching Gaming with Edo. Reviews over here on this playlist, League and Insider videos over here on this one. Subscribe, share, all that good stuff. But most importantly, play some great games. Thanks. Bye.